Welcome to a tutorial video on JavaScript basics. In this video, I'm going to talk about functions. In JavaScript, functions are sets of instructions. Sometimes they do things, and preferably they should do something, but they don't always have to. So these are set of instructions where we can pass data into a function and get data out of a function. When we pass data into a function, it's called a parameter. Some information we give to the function to do something with, hopefully. When we get information out of a function, it's called returning data, or a return statement. We see the first example of a function on lines 2 through 4. We have a function defined using the keyword function. We have a name similar to when we were defining variables in the previous two videos. We use the keyword function and then we give it a name. In this case, first solver. The parameters, the thing we're passing into the function, are defined within opening and closing parentheses. In this case, x and y. These are the things that are going to get passed into this function. The thing we're getting out of the function, the returning of data, is within this return statement, using the keyword return. And we see we are returning x plus y. So for whatever we send into this, the first thing we send in is going to be x. The second thing we send in is going to be y. And so we are returning the addition of the first parameter x and the second parameter y. Over here on the right hand side, we can see that right here with the value of 4. Let's come down here to line 19. We use a function by using its name, similar to when we were using variables in the previous two videos, and then within parentheses, we send it some data. Notice we're sending 2, 2, matching the exact same setup as when we defined it up here on line 2. Function first solver x, y. Its parameters x and y, and we returned x plus y. So the result of calling the function, using the function, was its name, and in parameters, the data we passed to it, its parameters. And we saw the result of 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. And we see that over here on the right-hand side. So our very first example of a function, we use the keyword function, we use its name. In parentheses, if we want any data to be passed to it, we separate its parameters using a comma, similar to how we separated entries in an array using a comma as well. So we can pass data into a function using its parameters. We can get data back out of it if we want to, using a return statement using the return keyword. This also, when a function comes into or encounters a return statement, it stops. It means that flow in the program returns to whatever called that function. We can think of functions then as not only a set of instructions, but a way to jump around within code structure. We can start to do something, send information off, send something as a parameter to a function to work on it, and then get that data back. But while flow changed, the function was then doing something and then returned not only the data, but returned control flow back to some program or some other code. So our program went down here to 19. 19 said, hey, go use this function and send it this data, 2, 2. It went back up to 2, line 2, and ran this function and said, okay, then return 2 plus 2. It returned it to line 19. Line 21 is a little different, but it's the same similar idea of changing program flow using functions to do a set of instructions. So we see on line 21, complex tasks. Now in this case, we're not sending any information to it. We're not using any parameters, and so it's just open and close parentheses. And that way it differentiates it between when we're using the names of variables in part 1 and 2, and this in part 3, how we're not using a variable, we're using a function. And so we're calling that function. We're saying, hey, go do something. So we're calling the function complex tasks. Complex tasks is defined on lines 6 through 17. So remember, a function is a set of instructions. So calling complex tasks, the control of the program is passing to complex tasks to do something. So I've mentioned in part 1 and in part 2 that variables use the metaphor of buckets. They contain some type of data. We discussed in part 1 how variables can be numbers and they can be in strings. In part 2, I showed how variables can also hold the value of arrays. In this part, I can show you that variables can also hold functions. And we see that on lines 9 through 11. The value of the variable second solver, notice the keyword var, so it's creating in a variable, setting its initial value to a function without a name, defined as part of the latter part of line 9 into line 11. So it's set to a function with the parameters x comma y, and it returns the addition of x comma y. That looks very similar to first solver we saw on lines 2 through 4. But we can also set, as I said, the value of a variable to be a function. And since it is defined as a function, we can treat it as if it were a function with the name of the variable. If that's a little confusing, we can think of it as a way as we can set the value of a variable, and we can use that variable as we have been in part 1 and in part 2 when it was either number or string or an array. But because it is a function, we can treat it as such. So we see here on line 13, second solver, similar to how it looked on line 19 with first solver, sending the two parameters, the first parameter 2, the second parameter 2, and passing control to this, which returns the addition of x plus y, parameter x plus parameter y. And so we see on line 13, the result is 4. So just like first solver that was defined as a function with its name first solver, we can set the value of a variable, like on line 9, to be equal to a function right here. Function x comma y's parameters and returning x plus y. We can also return complex tasks because this is a function inside another function done with complex tasks. So finally, on line 21, after we've gone into complex tasks, we've created the value of a new variable, second solver. We've then used that variable as a function. We can finally return back to line 21, and we see done with complex tasks because that is the string returned using the return keyword. Finally, another thing is important when we talk about functions in JavaScript and in many other programming languages, and that is something called scope. Functions have a scope. That is, things are defined in certain ways where they can be accessible in one way but not accessible in another. Let me show you an example of that. So we could use first solver because it's part of the global scope of this entire file. And we saw down here, we could easily call first solver with two parameters on line 19. We could also call the function complex tasks because like first solver, it's part of the same scope. Notice we called it on line 21. And if I run this again, I'll clear and run. We see 4 done with complex tasks, which is what we expect to see. However, if we attempted to call second solver outside of complex tasks, it would throw an error. And I'll do that now so we can see it. I'll copy, and then I'll paste it right here on line 21. We'll clear this, and we'll attempt to run this again. And it produced an error. This is a reference error. Second solver is not defined. Well, it is defined, but it's only defined within the scope of complex tasks. It is part of the local scope within that function because we didn't define it until line 9. Line 9 is inside the function define lines 6 through 17 now. So we have to remember this. Functions have scope. They are only readable, usable, callable within the scope in which they are defined. So because first solver was defined on line 2, part of the global scope, we could use it on line 19. We can't use second solver because it's not defined until inside this function line 9. But we could use complex tasks because it's defined on line 6, part of the global scope, and we could call it on line 23. So I'll take this back out. We'll clear this. We'll rerun it. And now we get what we expect to see, 4, 4, and done with complex tasks. So let's review all of this. Functions in JavaScript, like other programming languages, are something we can send data into as parameters. We separate those parameters using a comma. We can also get data back from a function by using a return statement and the return keyword. We saw here on line 2 through 4 that we define a function using the function keyword. Similar to how we were creating variables, we say function, and then we give it a name. Then, for its parameter list, we separate those by commas within parentheses. Using the return keyword, we can return some type of data. We can also then call that function and send it data as parameters, as we did here on line 19, 2, 2 for first solver, and then right here on 13, second solver, 2, 2. If a function does not expect any parameters, in its definition there are no parameters listed, we can simply call it by using an open and close parentheses after its name. We saw that on line 21 with complex tasks. I also covered program flow or control flow. We passed the flow, the control, over from what we were doing to a function because I defined a function as a set of instructions that does something. In the case of complex tasks, we went through the code on lines 8 through 15. The first of which was to create a variable, second solver, set to the value of a function. And I mentioned how variables, like they can be set to the values of arrays, and numbers and strings, can also be set to a function. So we then used the variable as if it was a function, because it had the value of a function on line 13 by sending the parameters 2, 2, and we saw the result was 4, just like we saw the result with first solver. We then returned the string, open quotes, close quotes around it, back to our program, and so we saw done with complex tasks after we saw the result of second solver, and finally it was all done. Thanks for watching.